So welcome everybody. Um, my name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center here at Bard College, and happy to be with you today for the virtual reading group. We're still reading The Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt. We are in the midst of this long and central section of the text on imperialism. Um, uh, this is, I think, one of the real insights of her work, that imperialism um, is is one of the core origins, one of the core elements uh, that leads to totalitarianism, right? And and we have looked at different aspects of that imperialism. The sort of general idea of imperialism, that it's a constant expansion and growth, that it's connected to the demand for power by the bourgeoisie, that it's connected to a rise in overseas imperialism of bureaucratic rule and bureaucratic governance. All of that has been in the first three chapters of this sort of central book on imperialism. Chapter 8 is one of the longest chapters in the book. I think it's one of the most difficult to read today, simply because it's just a history that I think many of us don't know. I mean, I know the first time I read this book, uh, uh, I was not aware of this whole history of the pan movements, the pan German movements and the pan Slavic movements. And I think it's just not a history that even many people today in modern Germany or Russia or Europe know much about. And so it is a bit sometimes difficult and dark to try and understand. And yet it's absolutely central, and we can't deny that. Um, we read on page 222, the first page of the chapter, that Nazism and Bolshevism, so the two great used in the sense of important and clearly of significance, the two great totalitarian movements of the 20th century, Nazism and Bolshevism, owe more to pan-Germanism and pan-Slavism, respectively, than to any other ideology or political movement. Pan-Germanism and pan-Slavism for Arendt are really more than any other movement or ideology, more than anti-Semitism, more than racism, more than anti-statism, a lot of the other elements of totalitarianism that she will talk about. These are the ones that really provide the ground for totalitarianism. And so if we want to understand totalitarianism, in many ways, this is the most important chapter in the book. And as I said, it's one of the most difficult. And so we're going to try and go through it a little slowly today. See if I can make it make some sense. And I really, I know we have lots of different styles of questions and stuff, but I hope that some of the questions will be about the text and about your attempt to understand this, because I do think this may be the central chapter of the whole book. So just to sort of put it in perspective and help understand the way this chapter works. If you look at the pan movements, right? Pan-Germanism and pan-Slavism, there are three parts of what the pan movements can represent. And those three parts will become the three parts of this chapter. So the first part relates to the word pan. Pan means all. And so these movements are all encompassing. they are going to be what she calls tribal nationalist movements that replace the nation state. They are pan movements, all encompassing movements, in that they seek to become movements for all Germans, wherever Germans are, right? Whether the Germans are living in Germany or Austria or in Poland or somewhere else, and for all Slavs. And thus, against the principle of the nation state, which is always limited because it's a territorial nation state, the pan movements are imperialist, all encompassing, and they are valid anywhere that Germans or Slavs might be, which is why they are part of this imperialist, constantly growing, world dominating movement. The second part is that insofar as these pan movements are not limited by a nation state, they are not state-oriented movements. They are imperialist movements, and thus they are driven by what she calls a contempt for the law. And as a result, they lead to an anti-Western mood, and in an anti-Western mood, an anti-nation state or legal mood, and thus they turn to lawlessness or bureaucracy as their mode of governance. And then the third part is movements, so the pan movements, and insofar as these pan movements were imperialist, seeking to encompass all Germans or all Slavs, and they embraced a bureaucratic regime as a mode of organization, she says that they really operated according to a mood. And this is, I know mood is not exactly a technical term, and yet it's one that's absolutely central for Arendt's understanding of totalitarianism. The point is that pan-Germanism, she says, and also pan-Slavism, discovered how much more important a general mood was for creating a new administrative, non-legal, anti-legal form of government than any particular interests or party platforms that could be laid down. She says the only thing that counts in a movement is that it be kept in motion. And so these pan movements did not actually have strong interest-based political platforms. What they had was a sense of constantly moving forward to achieve a mood, a goal of unity of their Germans or of Slavs. And so these three parts, the pan-tribal nationalism, the anti-state, anti-law administrative lawlessness, and the fact that they replaced interest-based parties with non-party movements or movements that were above parties, are the three parts of this chapter, and they're the three parts of the pan movements that she thinks are central for understanding totalitarianism. She characterizes the pan movements in a number of ways mostly in the first 4 or 5 pages of the chapter, and it's not systematic. And I think it's hard. I think these first 2 or 3 pages of this chapter may be some of the harder pages of the books to really parse. And so I've identified almost 18 different elements of what she calls these pan movements in these first few pages. And I'm just going to sort of go through them quickly because they give you a sense of the mood that she's talking about. The first on page 223 is that these pan movements are anti-national, right? They're not seeking to create a nation state. They are imperialist. They are pan. They're bigger than any kind of state or nation state aspect. The cohesive element that they promise is not economics. They don't promise like a kind of economic growth or economic security. What they promise is an enlarged tribal consciousness. And this tribal consciousness, enlarged tribal consciousness unites people of a similar folk, or in German with a V, Volk, in English, folk. And it's independent of history or geography. The point is not that the Germans or the Slavs, all speak the same language. Sometimes they don't. It's not that they live in the same country or the same place. They don't. They may have even different histories, but they are, because of their fact that they're Germans or they're Slavs, somehow united in this tribal consciousness. This continental imperialism, she says, is thus closer to race and racial concepts than its similar version of overseas imperialism, right? Overseas imperialism, goes over and rules over foreign peoples. And there's a racial element to that, which we saw in Egypt with Lord Cromer and India and South Africa. But continental imperialism is not just, one race here, one group here rolling over another group. It's actually a tribal consciousness of people, and we base them not on location or geography, but on race. And so it's even more racialized than overseas imperialism. As a result, it really wasn't supported by capitalists or businessmen. She says the race concepts also were not based on specific experiences. The Germans in Russia were not recognizably German. They were made to be German. And so it mobilizes this pan-German ideology as a political weapon. The ideological focus of pan movements, she says, makes them particularly attractive to intellectuals. And this is an important point to consider. The people who supported these pan movements were not generally capitalists or business people, who were often the people, right, driving overseas imperialism. We read about that in the chapter on the bourgeoisie. These were not the pan movements are actually driven by lawyers, teachers, professors, students, and civil servants. It's much more of an intellectual movement than it is a capitalist or economic movement. So she says they originated on the campuses among students and faculty. She says they're more radical, these pan movements, than other similar movements, because unlike regular imperialism or overseas imperialism, it didn't seek to rule over other colonies and other states. It actually sought to destroy all politics, all political institutions, including, and most importantly, the state. So it was a kind of destructive, nihilist movement in an important way, which will come up again later in the book. In the midst of this frenzy of disintegration or nihilism and social atomization, the breakup of people and people's feeling that they're not part of a movement, she says what men wanted most of all was to belong to a group, a movement at any price. And what the pan movements offered was an ideology that was more attractive to everyday people than tangible political gains or interests, economic interests, or other social interests. And so this is what she means by the mood, that the pan movements are held together more by a general mood than any clearly defined interests or aims. With no specific program, right? They weren't conservative or liberal or progressive or radical. They were simply about creating this mood. They sought, she calls, an all-encompassing mood of, quote, total predominance, the pure will to dominate. This is on 225. So what these pan movements wanted was to take these atomized, unhappy, precarious citizens and give them a sense of being part of a tribal movement that was going to dominate and that would win, and make them thus feel powerful. If overseas imperialism, she says, is dominated by capital, which is in alliance with the mob, but over the mob, and such that the mob works for capital, and that was true for most overseas imperialism, with the exception of South Africa. In the pan movements, she says it's the mob that dominates. A mob is led by, quote, a certain branch of intellectuals who know how to organize the mob and are aware of how race can be used to fire the mob and organize the mob. And that's on page 226. And so the mob becomes central in these pan movements, organized by intellectuals. The expansion of imperialism in these pan movements, she says, is justified on racial grounds to bring Germans outside the Reich into the Reich, right? So Germans outside in, or Slavs outside of Russia back into the fold. And in that sense, there's a kind of holiness to this pseudo-mystical pan-Slavism or pan-Germanism. The Holy German Empire, Holy Mother Russia, offers a kind of what she calls pseudo-mystical nonsense that is what inspires this effort to bring all Germans or all Slavs together. These movements, she says, are largely comprised of intellectuals, as I said before, who are interested in this pseudo-mystical nonsense. She says tribal nationalism begins from a mystical element, which is to be realized in the future, not in the past. And thus the temporality of these pan movements is futural. And intellectuals are good at imagining a future idea that could be brought into being. Finally, she says that such tribal nationalism imagines a people, whether it's the Germans or the Slavs, of one against all, and thus, like racism itself, denies the humanity of man and sees politics as a zero-sum game of conflict between different nations. Okay, so that's a series of if you read the first 5 pages of the chapter, a series of points, insights, claims that she makes that I think help to elaborate what I've tried to call this mood that she's talking about, and that I think is absolutely central to understanding the chapter. The chapter then is, as I said, broken into 3 parts. The first part is on tribal nationalism, and that begins on page 227. Tribal nationalism emerged from two frustrations. The failure to found a nation state. So there were a number of, dozens of nations throughout Europe that were never encompassed in a nation state. So the Roma, the Jews, the Slavs as a whole, the Czechs had Czechoslovakia, but what about the Slovaks? And there were many others. And then the second frustration was the failure to achieve national emancipation for many of these states. And she says, out of those 2 frustrations, there became this idea of, well, we want a tribal nationalism. And that the second point she wants to make here is that for these tribal nationalisms, anti-Semitism became the mainstay of these movements. She makes that point on 229. Both pan-Slavism and pan-Germanism make anti-Semitism absolutely central to their worldview. And she says this is true, even though for many of the people who were engaged in promoting pan-Slavism and pan-Germanism, they had almost no experience of Jewish people. And so we have to understand that this is a particularly modern form of anti-Semitism, not really aimed at a hatred of Jews, but using anti-Semitism as a political weapon, as an ideology aimed at the state. Remember, these are movements that are aimed at the destruction of the state. So this goes back in many ways to a lot of our discussion with chapter 2, the Jews, the nation state, and the birth of anti-Semitism, where she wants to argue that anti-Semitism emerged as a political weapon against the state, and to the extent that the Jews got associated with the state early on. In this pan movements, it's not just that the Jews were associated with the state. It's that for example, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was a multi-ethnic state, an attack on the Jews was an attack on all nationalities, and thus an attack on the very nature of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so she is going to talk about how attacking the Jews became part of an attack on the imperial structure. At the same time, we'll start to see that a big part of the claim of these pan-Slavic movements, as I mentioned before, is this mood of holiness, of chosenness. And in an ironical twist, since the Jews had always seen themselves as a chosen people, they became the minority that these pan-Slavic, pan-German movements set themselves against, because they saw the Jews as the biggest competitor in their claim for world dominance. I mean, of course, the Jews were not dominating the world, but they imagined that they were. This tribal nationalism that she's here starting to think about is to be distinguished from Western nationalism, and this is a really important point, because, you know, we think of nationalism as nationalism, and she's saying here that we actually have to make a distinction. So Marx, she says, understood that Western nationalism is based in the emancipation of peasants who become the conscious bearers of the nation. And she writes about this on page 229 to 230. In this Western view that Marx understood, nationalism requires that people acquire a consciousness of themselves as a cultural and historical entity. And so they have a territory which is a national home. And there are migrations come to an end. People become part of France or Germany or Italy. And they form a geographical locus of citizenship. And the emancipated peasants form a national consciousness as Germans, Frenchmen, Englishmen, or Italians, or whatever. And the prototypical institution of these Western nation states is the army, in which all people in France, or all people in Italy, and all people in Germany can serve in the army as Italians or Germans, whatever their historical provenance may be. But against this kind of Western nationalism is what she sees emerging with these pan movements, and she calls tribal nationalism, which is not nationalist. She says on page 229, tribal nationalism, the driving force behind the Continental Imperialism, had little in common with the nationalism of fully developed Western nation states. If the nation sought national rights and the state sought the rights of man, this tribal nationalism was something very different. It was born in what she calls rootlessness. And so tribal nationalism is a nationalism without a nation state, right? There is no state for all Germans. There is no state for all Slavs. And so it's born of those people whose national consciousness has no territorial home, who are rootless. It can't thus end immigration, right? It can't provide a national consciousness that's geographically focused and that has institutions like an army that provide a home for people. It's restless, it's rootless. And so on 232, she'll say rootlessness was the true source of that enlarged tribal consciousness, which actually meant that members of these people had no definite home, but felt at home wherever other members of their tribe happened to live. And thus this tribal consciousness, she says on 232, is a new form of organization, the pan movements. It's not a nation state, right? And a nation state, and we'll talk about this more next week when we talk about chapter 9 on the nation state, but a nation state is a contradiction. A state is a legal entity which treats all people equally, but a nation state has one people, the national people, which is hierarchically superior to the rest. And it was this conflict between the nation and the state, which she says leads to the breakdown of nation states. And we'll talk about that in chapter 9. That's the topic of chapter 9. But here the point is that this tribal consciousness began to emerge in these pan-Slavic and pan-German movements. And the hallmark of these movements is that they include all of what was called in German the Staatsfremde, the people who are not a part of your state, so they're aliens to your state, but are part of your folk. So Germans living in Austria, Germans living in Germany, Germans living in Poland, Germans living in Russia. These were Staatsfremde. These were people who weren't in your state and yet were part of who you were. And the idea was to create a new movement, a new imperialist pan movement that would include Germans or Slavs everywhere where they were. And this futural consciousness of a folk community um, is the sort of source of this pseudo-mystical, divinely chosen tribal consciousness. So tribal nationalism in this sense replaces the idea of a human dignity in which all people can be citizens of a state with the idea of national dignity. It's now no longer the case that if you live in Germany and you're Jewish or you're Czech or you're Russian, you can become a member of the German state. You have to be German, right? Or you have to be Slavic in order to be a member of the pan-Slavist state. And so there's a contempt for the liberal idea of a dignity of man. And there's no distinctly human dignity left in these pan-tribal movements. All of this, she has another section of this chapter. And again, this chapter is not organized so well, but I think you're starting to get a sense, a hope of this mood of tribal consciousness. But what she says is that in Europe, in Central Europe, what she calls the belt of Eastern European nations, in which these national consciousness began to emerge, a terror began to emerge. And the terror was the terror at the idea of a common origin of man, or the idea of humanity, or the idea of the dignity of man. Why do these different groups start to feel a sense of dread or terror at the other groups? She says because they knew them, they interacted with them, and they knew that these people, these other groups, so the Slavs or the Czechs, could do evil. And the more people know about one another, she says on page 235, the less they want to recognize other peoples as their equals, the more they recoil from the ideal of humanity. I mean, we have to take this seriously. This is so against most of our common sense. She cites a footnote in footnote 41. She cites a man named Freiman, and he writes, quote, "We know our own people, its qualities and shortcomings. Mankind we do not know, and we refuse to care or get enthusiastic about it. One can believe in the solidarity of the Germanic peoples. Whoever is outside this sphere does not matter to us." This goes against not only our liberal idea that we can all be part of one idea of humanity, of the dignity of man, that all people have a kind of equal dignity, but it goes against the liberal idea that the more we educate ourselves and get to know other peoples, the more we will come to respect them, right? The idea is if we have cultural exchanges between Russians and Americans or Israelis and Palestinians, we'll come to see them as real human beings, and we'll we'll learn to respect them. And Arendt says that's actually not usually the case. I mean, yeah, and when you first meet, you can have dinner together and you can talk. But when push comes to shove, when the chips are down, as she likes to say, knowing someone well just means in your mind that they're not you, and they will in the end sell you up the river, and you can sell them up the river. And we believe in the end in our tribes. This is a very controversial idea that that in the end the people of Eastern Europe saw people in a tribal way. and they trusted their tribe and they didn't trust other tribes. And if we ask the question of how can we be responsible, right, for humanity, her answer is, in the end, most of us can't. We reject such a common responsibility. And she says the rejection of such a common responsibility makes idealistic talk about mankind and the dignity of man an affair of the past. That's on 235. I bring this up because I think, you know, it's a fact. This is one of those parts of Arendt that is a challenge for many of us and many liberals. It's one in which she is aware of the deeply tribal nature of humanity in some way. She's not in any way saying we have to just then break into tribes and not develop a politics that overcomes tribes. She thinks we have to, but it's much harder than we might imagine. All right. The second part of the chapter is on the administrative bureaucratic system, or what she calls lawlessness. And the key here is that there's an inheritance of lawlessness. There's an affinity between bureaucratic machines and movements, and that affinity is that they both have an open disregard of law. There are two ideas of bureaucracy, she says, that are similar and yet different. And this is a really important distinction. So one idea of bureaucracy is the deformation of the civil service as inefficient, vexatious, and pursuing its own interest, right? I think this is the idea of democracy that we today sometimes call the deep state, or you know, the bureaucratic class, or the civil servant class, or the professional managerial elite, as it's sometimes called today, the professional managerial class. And this group has entrenched itself at times in a body politic like a parasite, she says on page 244, and developed its own class interests and become a useless organism whose only purpose appears to be chicanery and prevention of normal economic development. This is the bureaucracy as we see it in many modern liberal democracies. She says it's inefficient and vexatious, but it's still, in the end, answerable to law. And it's thus, it doesn't yet have a kind of pseudo-mystical aura to it. But the other idea of bureaucracy is the pseudo-mystical bureaucratic machine. This is where the administrator considers the law powerless and acts beyond the law. In governments, she says on page 244, in governments, by bureaucracy, decrees appear in their naked purity as though they were no longer issued by powerful men, but were the incarnation of power itself, and the administrator only its accidental agent. So if you take seriously the attack on the administrative state or the deep state that's going on today in American politics and in politics around the world, you know, you have to ask yourself, is the attack on it simply an attack on a vexatious and inefficient bureaucracy, and one that is designed to still bring the bureaucracy within law? Or is the attack an attempt to undo all legal limits and create a pseudo-mystical bureaucratic machine in a rule by decree? And for her, these pan movements saw laws to be not only incompatible with power, they were sinful, man-made snares that prevented the full development of the divine power of these movements. And so these were anti-legal movements, and they saw as bureaucracy as the way to embrace the full power of their movements. So on 249, she can write, it is the absoluteness of movements which more than anything else separates them from party structures and their partiality. These absolute movements are above parties and above partiality, and thus become simply about power. and they justify their claim to overrule all objections of individual conscience or law. She says the leaders of these pan movements began to tell the mob that each of its members could become a lofty, all-important, walking embodiment of something ideal if he would only join the movement. And this is that feeling of power that they offer to the mob and the masses. The third part of this chapter is called Movements versus Parties. And the point is that these pan movements are movements. They're not parties. Parties for Arendt, in the end, are interest-based. They seek economic or other social interests. The movements, though, are not about interest. They're about a mood. And so on page 260, she can write, long before Nazism proudly pronounced that though it had a program, it did not need one. So it didn't need a program. Pan-Germanism discovered how much more important for mass appeal a general mood was than laid down outlines and platforms. For the only thing that counts in a movement is precisely that it keeps itself in constant movement. The Nazis, she says, referred to the Weimar Republic as the system site, the time of the system. And the implication was that the Weimar Republic was sterile. It lacked dynamism. It was a system. It had laws. It had constitutions. You know, you had checks and balances. Things went slowly. It was boring. And that boringness is exactly what the problem was. She cites in a wonderful footnote on where she talks by someone named Berdyaev, talks about how a Russian comes to France and says the French have no idea of freedom because everything is sort of stagnant here. There's no revolution. There's no radicalness. And so the decisive invention of the pan movements, she says, was not that they claimed to be outside or above the party system, but that they called themselves movements. And you know, if you look at the wide predominance of movements in modern politics today in 2023, all over the world, the rise of movements, whether it's the MAGA movement or the Black Lives Matter movement or the environmental movement or the populist movements, the fact that everyone's calling themselves movements is indicative of this recognition of the power of moods over actual interests. The totalitarian state, she'll say, this is citing Carl Schmitt on page 266. He says, the totalitarian state is a state in appearance only, and the movement no longer truly identifies itself even with the needs of the people. The movement by now is above state and people, ready to sacrifice both for the sake of ideology. The movement is state as well as people, and neither the present state nor the German people can even be conceived without the movement. And this is the mood that she's interested in here. One or two just caveats, and then we'll end. This is one of the reasons that Arendt becomes convinced that a two-party political system like you had in Britain and in America was preferable to a multi-party representational system, a parliamentary system like you had on the continent. And the reason is that in a multi-party system, each party represents a particular interest. The Conservative Party represents the landed elite. The Green Party represents the environment. The Social Democrat represents the workers. None of them have to actually represent the state above a particular interest. Whereas in a two-party system, in order to get over 50%, the parties actually have to identify themselves beyond a particular interest with the national interest. And she thinks that change, that difference is key. And it's one of the reasons, I mean, I know so many people today on the, in my world think, oh, we need, it's better to have a parliamentary system of many parties because then you can find a party you fully agree with that represents your interests. But that for Arendt is exactly what is dangerous, because it pushes you to pick a party that's not representing a national interest, but a particular interest. And in doing so, you might become embarrassed that you're so fundamentally focused on your interest, and that turns your justification for pursuing your interest into an ideology. The last point of interest or that I'm going to talk about in this chapter is she then makes this distinction between fascism and totalitarianism. Whereas totalitarianism is a movement, fascism is not. And again, here's another super controversial and fascinating aspect of this chapter. For her, Mussolini, who is a true fascist, is not someone who is dangerous, right? Because Mussolini used a movement to seize power, but once he seized power, he, in a sense, sought to elevate the state, the army, and other institutions, and he sought to create a national interest. And so she says the state, even as a one-party dictatorship, was felt to be in the way of the ever-changing needs of an ever-growing movement in totalitarian countries, but not in Italy. And so she actually says that there can be good democratic reasons to elect a dictator every once in a while, which, by the way, the Romans knew as well, right? The Romans had a mechanism for when there was a need for it, electing a dictator who would be temporary. And I'm not here at all suggesting that Arendt is in favor of electing a dictator, but she doesn't think electing a dictator is devastating to liberal freedom, whereas she does think that electing that having a totalitarian government is devastating to freedom. All right, I'm going to end there. I mean, this is a fascinating, big, difficult chapter, maybe one of the most difficult chapters in all of Arendt's work. But I'll stop there and open it to questions. I remind you, please, to be civil and thoughtful in your interactions with people, both in the chat and raising your hands. And I look forward to hopefully a discussion that takes her work seriously, because there's so much in this chapter that's controversial, thought-provoking, fascinating, and I'd love to hear what you have to think about it. All right, Hannah.
Yes. Hi. I think this chapter deserves at least 2 of your sessions, Roger. Because as you say, it is so thick. Although I thought we were doing I thought we were doing 9, and I've been reading 9 and 10 and having much more trouble getting through those than getting through this chapter, which I found extraordinarily engaging. But also I had to keep Googling certain things to fill in gaps of knowledge. But one thing that you didn't, well, there are several things I would have kind of found it easier to deal with is if she had mentioned specific pan movements at the time, like, like the Austrian party pan movement or a German party pan movement, names of movements. I mean, I'm assuming National Socialism is a pan movement. Am I wrong?
Yes. So, let me say, so she does, I mean, she's talking about 2 very particular pan movements. National Socialism
There's a party.
is a party that doesn't emerge until later, right?
Right. But there were
A
earlier German movements, right?
Hannah, just let me answer your
Sure.
question because it's kind of helpful. So,
Sure.
if you take a look at page 238, right? She'll tell you, specifically what here an example. She'll say middle of page 238, Pan-Germanism was founded by a single man, Georg von Schoner, and chiefly supported by German Austrian students. And it spoke from the beginning a strikingly vulgar language destined to appeal to a much larger and different social strata. Schoner was consequently the first to perceive the possibilities of anti-Semitism as an instrument for forcing the direction of foreign policy and disrupting the internal structure of the state. So, Schoner and the pan-Germanists are for her, one example of the pan movements. The other is the pan-Slavic movements, and she talks about the people who are involved with that as well. All of these are prior to the rise of National Socialism. That said, she sees Hitler as a student of von Schoner, but she thinks there are differences, which she goes into. The point is that she does provide. I think one of the things that's interesting and challenging about this chapter is she really is talking about two specific pan movements.
Okay, I
Deutsche,
read it and I understand that. I thought that there might be many more within the Pan-German and the Pan-Slavic. I read this, but I thought that was more of an umbrella term, and that there were more specific Pan-German movements than
well,
just
there
the
are different
overall name.
there are different parties, and there was a party there's the All Deutsche Verband in Germany, and there was another one in Austria. Rozanov is the sort of main Russian ideologue behind the
That's what I was looking for.
Slavic movements. So there's a bunch, but she sees them as of a piece, and she uses a couple of the figures that she thinks are the most intellectually influential as sort of her groundings for them. But if you
Okay,
if you look through the footnotes, right, and the footnotes
yes,
in the chapter are very important, um, you'll see, mentions of all sorts of different leaders of Pan-Slavism and Pan-Germanism that she's referring to on a specific basis. Yeah.
okay. Thank you. Because I thought we were reading chapter 9, I spent only about 3 hours so far in this chapter, so it requires about 20 more hours.
Yeah.
Um, exactly. But the other thing that I thought was absolutely mesmerizing that I've gotten so far is the idea of chosenness um, as being the driving force of the anti-Semitism that emerged out of these pan movements, because uh, the pan movement people wanted to feel that the idea that their origins simply as Germans, or that they spoke the German language, meant that they were chosen, and that was what made them special, is to be chosen. But that the doctrine of the chosen people of the Jews, which came way before, obviously, infuriated them, and that was an engine that was the engine, she said, for the anti-Semitism. I found that fascinating. Also a little confusing in terms of what she said, that she was sort of intimating that the idea of the chosen people, with which my father dealt with quite a bit um, uh, in Judaism, was supposed to, in the end, produce a common humanity, which I thought was very, very interesting, um, uh, and a little bit different take. So I just thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, it's worth just taking a look at some of these pages where on what Hannah is talking about from 238 to 241. Um, the point is that on 239, she'll say in this first full paragraph, Schoner discovered anti-Semitism and became aware of its possibilities almost by accident, since he wanted above all to destroy the Habsburg Empire, right? These are anti-state organizations. It was not difficult to calculate the effect of the exclusion of one nationality on a state structure that rested on a multitude of nationalities. The point is that the Habsburg Empire, right, was fascinating. It was a multi-ethnic, multinational empire, and it actually gave all sorts of different minority groups rights to live in certain ways. And if you start excluding one, you tear apart the very foundation of a multi-ethnic, multinational empire. You attack the state. Now, what made anti-Semitism, she says, so effective, was that the Jews were the kind of rootless people, a sort of a perfect model for the kind of rootlessness and people without a state. That was exactly what the Pan Germans and Pan Slavs wanted to create. And thus, as Hannah just said, there's a kind of irony to this. but and a kind of bitter revenge. But they picked the Jews because the Jews were the people they saw as the ones that challenged their own claim to chosenness most directly. And by the way, this precisely this point is one that Adolf Eichmann makes in his Sassen interviews in Argentina in the late 1950s. Just there's an extra little thing for you, but it's worth us being aware of. So yeah, thank you, Hannah.
Thank you.
Jason.
Yes, Roger, thank you for a tour de force on this chapter and bringing this together. I can't imagine making sense of this in 45 minutes.
Jason, I'm going to interrupt you for Jason, can I interrupt you for 1 second? Can you turn your camera off because you're having a hard time hearing you?
Here, I hope that helps.
Let's see.
Does that help?
So far, yes.
Let's try. Okay, so I wanted to take us back to page 235, where you specifically brought about the one question that really kind of broke my soul here reading this chapter, which was the denial of a common humanity based on additional interaction. And I wanted to know, is that going to be something that is specific to large groups? I know this is more sociology question. Or is it going to be consistent regardless of the scale of interactions we're talking about?
Thanks, Jason. It's a great question. Let's look at the passage, because it's one that when I teach this book, I spend a fair bit of time on, and it's worth reading. So on midway through 235, she writes, the appeal of tribal isolation and master race ambitions was partly due to an instinctive feeling that mankind, whether a religious or humanistic ideal, implies a common sharing of responsibility. So let's just see if we can understand that there's an instinctive feeling that if we're all human, whether this is a religious feeling or a humanistic feeling, we have a common sense of responsibility for our fellow humans. And then look at this footnote, right? 41, where she says, citing Freiman, we know our own people, its qualities and its shortcomings. Mankind we do not know, and we refuse to care or get enthusiastic about it. Where does it begin? Where does it end? That we are supposed to love because it belongs to mankind. Are the decadent or half-bestial Russian peasant of the Mir, the Negro of East Africa, the half-breed of German Southwest Africa, or the unbearable Jews of Galicia and Romania, all members of mankind? One can believe in the solidarity of the Germanic peoples. Whoever is outside this sphere does not matter to us. That's something that is obviously difficult for many of us to read or listen to. But she continues, the shrinking of geographic distances made this political actuality of the first order. It also made idealistic talk about mankind and the dignity of man an affair of the past, simply because all these fine and dreamlike notions with their time-honored traditions suddenly assumed a terrifying timeliness. Even insistence on the sinfulness of all men, of course absent from the phraseology of the liberal protagonists of mankind, by no means suffices for an understanding of the fact that the idea of humanity purged of all sentimentality has the very serious consequence that in one form or another men must assume responsibility for all crimes committed by men. And she continues, tribalism and racism are the very realistic, if very destructive ways of escaping this predicament of common responsibility. So Clearly she's here critical of tribalism and racism, right? She's critical of these ideas that we should deny mankind, that we should deny the dignity of man. And yet somehow, right? I think she sees tribalism, if not racism she thinks is the death of mankind. But she says, I mean, in the sentence before where we began on page 235, the last sentence of the first full paragraph, she says, the more peoples know about one another, the less they want to recognize other peoples as their equals, the more they recoil from the ideal of humanity. I mean, there's a psychological claim here that she's making, right? That the more we know about people who we see as other to us, as different from us, the more somehow, even if we can like them, even if we can have dinner with them and friends with them and work with them and have them in our classes, somehow she's saying, it makes us question this idea that there's just one humanity, because the more we know them, the more we know they're different, if they're really different. You know, I mean, this is a question you're all going to have to like ask about yourselves in your soul, right? When you get to know someone who's really different from you and you find them fascinating and you find them interesting and you talk to them and you do things with them and you become friends with them. But if they really fundamentally believe that the Messiah has come and you believe that the Messiah hasn't come, or if they fundamentally believe that revenge is necessary to be human and you think revenge is evil, at some point, the more you know them and the more you understand that on the one hand, you like them and agree with them, and yet on the other hand, you find them fully other. Doesn't that actually challenge your belief in humankind? And that's what she's saying. And that tribalism is a reaction to that feeling. And that there are ways to overcome tribalism for her. But those ways of overcoming tribalism are political. They're forming political institutions that allow us to exist in a common political world, even if we don't trust each other and don't always like each other. That's politics for Hannah Arendt. But the idea that we're all going to just like each other and agree with each other is to her an affront to humanity, an affront to the idea of plurality, to the affront to the idea that we actually are fundamentally different. And the rise of these pan movements and these tribal nationalisms is, in a sense, a result of people's rejection of the liberal idea that was dominant, that we all should just get along and somehow be part of one humanity. And it was a rebellion against a sense of many people that that's just wrong. I understand that this is going to be a discomforting idea for many of us, but at least try and understand what she's saying. George?
Well, a lot more work ahead of us.
Yeah. George, do you want to say something, George?
I was going to say that Arendt was about more than 70 years ahead of current science. I was reading one of the Nature journals, I think the October issue of this year, where they speak about the same thing, really, but they call it collective narcissism, which I think is a more specific and easier way to think of it, what they say, and I put it, some of it in the chat, is people seek to belong to groups that they evaluate positively identify with. However, when group identity is motivated by frustrated psychological needs, it can manifest as collective narcissism, a belief that one's group is exceptional and deserves special treatment. Basically, it's the same thing, only in modern lingo. And I think that it's an interesting thing to read if you have access to it.
Yeah, thank you, George. I mean, most of us don't have access to Nature because it's a very expensive and elitist publication. But for those of us who are at universities, I think we probably do. So, um, I don't know if you can circulate that link to us, George, in the chat, and maybe Yana can at least find it for us and send it out. I don't know. But I think it's
really Nature. It's Nature October 5th. So they say, I don't know if I have that link available. I'll try to do it, but otherwise just Nature Magazine's October 5th. And just put in Nature Magazine and you put in narcissism and you'll get it.
Thank you. James. James, you got to unmute.
Roger, when I first started reading this chapter the first time through, I thought, man, what I should do is just chop it all up in little pieces and smoke it, and then maybe I would get it. And then I started starting to comprehend what is going on, which you just so beautifully articulated. And I found myself saying, oh my God, let's go MAGA, baby. Let's go MAGA and find out what's really, really out there, because the forces at play that are described in this chapter are happening right now. And I can't wait. I can't wait to see the games played. What are we going to do? And my little pussy version of myself, which is this humanist and ambassador for UNICEF and all mankind and blah, 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 out the window, baby. What's my next step?
Yeah, James.
She stripped me clean.
James, I love the way you put things. Thank you so much. You know, there's an undoubted temptation in reading this, and not only you should be asking yourselves the questions you're asking. James is asking. You know, and there are ways in which, look, there are many movements in politics right now, right? You know, if you take the MAGA movement, it's one. And in some levels, you can see a lot of parallels between a pan-Slavic, pan-German movement and a MAGA movement. They're both, there's a real disdain for the state. There's a disdain for legality.
Yes, yes.
There's a, you know, if you take seriously some of what the former president has been saying and desire to, in a sense, replace many of the, or eliminate many of the, you know, the bureaucracies, and replace them with people of his own choosing. On the other hand, you know, if you take it, you could look at it the other way and say, you know, they want to get rid of some of these bureaucracies to bring back a kind of what they see as a respect for law. You know, I don't want to get into an argument about it. But I think the biggest difference is that she sees these movements as futural, not focused on the greatness of a past. Whereas the explicit rhetoric of, just to give the example of MAGA, is very much about a return to what made America great in a past and not a futural. It's not about bringing a racialized group of people who are outside of the current America state into America. It's not an imperialist movement in that sense. It's much more of a sort of backwards looking nation state movement, at least as, you know, as I've understood it. I don't claim to know everything about it. And so that would make it quite different from some of these movements that she's describing. But the overarching idea of a movement that is clearly aimed at weakening and destroying elements of the state and mobilizing racial and tribal language in order to destroy institutions of the state is, I think, there. And so I don't think it's a direct analogy, but I think there's a lot to unite them. And by the way, there are other movements going on around the world, also in this country, that also dislike certain rules and limits and laws, and very much want to replace limiting state legal structures with decrees, but from another direction. And so I think what you can say is that the mood of dissatisfaction with boring, limited political life that tries to preserve freedoms but doesn't try to make radical changes is clearly unpopular with many people in the country and in the world on both the left and the right. And that's that's certainly a dangerous moment. And I think that's one thing you should take from reading this book.
Add a little climate change, and we're really going to have a hot time together.
Exactly.
Ooh.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you. Dina.
Hi, I had a question about the intellectuals you discussed based on page 226. I'm wondering, it's interesting because on the one hand, I think later on, Arendt will say that intellectuals represent or are illustrative of the atomization of individuals in mass society. And because they're illustrative of that, they sort of self-abandon into this movement. But what else do they get out of it, being part of a movement? If in general one considers them to be non-joiners, I think she says that on 317. So later, what is the attraction for an intellectual to lose themselves in a movement if all along they've sort of exhibited a atomized way of life?
Yeah. That's a great question, Dina. She won't answer it fully until I think it's the section on the alliance between intellectuals and the mob, which I'm trying to figure out where it is in the book. I think it's going to be in.
I think it's a classless society.
Oh, it's in a classless society. Yeah. And in that, it's on page 334. She'll answer your question, right? She'll say the attraction which the totalitarian movements exert on the elite, so long as and wherever they have not seized power, has been perplexing, because the patently vulgar and arbitrary positive doctrines of totalitarianism are more conspicuous to the outsider and mere observer than the general mood which pervades the pre-totalitarian movement. But she then goes on to discuss Bertolt Brecht's Three-Penny Opera, Drei Groschen Oper. And what you'll come to see in these sections is that the elite were so disdainful of the status quo, of the corruption, of the feeling of capitalism and money running the world, of the utter disdain that the elite had for kind of a corrupt capitalist bureaucratic world, that they took incredible joy in standing aloof from that world and watching it burn.
Mhm.
And so the joy that the elite take is the joy of destruction.
Mhm.
They see themselves as superior. And as you said, standing apart. And in standing apart, they see themselves as the group that's willing to, without interest, without having a strong partisan view for the, for the environmentalists or for the MAGA people or for the Black Lives Matter or for the indigenous rights people. They just like seeing all these different ideologues attack the state and watching it fall apart because it's so corrupt.
Mhm.
And that's the interest the elite has, she thinks.
So in a way, it's self-vindicating in the sense that I've stood apart, I've told you, and now.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It's a kind of nihilistic watching it burn, right?
Mhm.
And you see that today. There's a lot of people who take this position. Trump is corrupt and a danger to the republic, but so is Biden corrupt. The Democrats are as bad as the Republicans. What we just want to do is tear it all apart, right? Let it burn. There's a guy who wrote an anonymous article 6 years ago, or no, 10 years in 2016 called the 9/11 election, in which he basically argued that the reason to vote for Trump was not because you thought Trump was right or good, but because Trump was the only one who was going to tear the country apart.
Mhm.
And that we needed that kind of destruction to allow the country to be reborn. I forget the guy's name who wrote it. He's a well-known conservative intellectual. He used to write for the Claremont Review a lot, which is where he published that article. But I think that's there are a lot of people today who take that position. Jerry, good to see you. How are you, my friend?
Very well, thank you, Roger. Listening to you today, this book really, it's such a living thing. And in a way, what I'm going to say follows James Kibbert's remarks, and maybe call for speculation, which is not, you don't want to share, and that I understand completely. But I was very, very struck when Roger, that Arendt never considered this country, our country, a nation state. And I won't go into all the reasons why, but I wonder if today she might not see in it something like tribal nationalism, which may be called a brand, if one prefers another term. What I mean by that is that there seem to be no parties today that are completely distinguishable in this country. Superficially, yes, of course. I mean, you read the craziest things. I read today, I got an email saying that 1 million Democrats had become Republicans in the past week or something like that. And you get every day 20 emails from Nancy Pelosi begging you for $5. But it seems to me that beyond all that, there are earmarks of what Arendt calls a tribal nationalism. And that's this American brand that seems to go out all over the world, attractive to many people, unattractive to fewer people. And I wondered if that is it all the distinction that I'm trying to make between nation state and a sort of tribal nationalism is relevant today in America.
Thanks, Jerry. Yeah, so in a way, if I understand your question correctly, and I think I do, you're asking almost, isn't Americanism a kind of imperialist tribal nationalism?
Yeah.
So,
He said, just let me say, it would be the irony of it. It appeals to me very much, since this nation was founded by eliminating actual tribes, if we have not become something like a tribe ourselves.
yeah, no, it's an interesting point. I mean, I think Arendt, Arendt, as Jerry says, did call America the only non-nation state, the only true sort of state. And she did so for a number of reasons, but a large part because she felt that, is the one place where, as a Jew, you could be both Jewish and American. You could be Irish and American. I think the critique of her view is that for a long time, the one thing you couldn't do is be Black and American. And I think she had a blindness to that, at least in part. But the creed of America, if you accept that, is that it is the place in which everyone should be able to be an American, no matter what their provenance, what their race, what their religion is. And insofar as that's the creed, is it now possible to be not only Jewish and American, but also Black and American? And we could have an argument about that. But if so, isn't that a kind of tribal, isn't that anti-tribalism a kind of tribalism, just like cosmopolitanism is itself a tribalism? And isn't it one that we should expand and push all over the world? And over since World War II, this sort of kind of Pax Americana, this liberal world order, has emerged, in which many people, as Jerry said, have found it advantageous to sort of see America as we all want to become Americans in some way. What we see in the last 15 or 20 years is the rise of real opposition to that, with China, Russia, Iran, basically pushing back against this idea of a kind of, liberal civil rights, human rights, non-nation state approach. India as well. And you're seeing a return to a kind of tribal nationalism and a rejection of the American creed. There's also a question of to what extent America itself is turning against that creed with certain of its movements. And I think that's also an important question. So, to see America itself as a kind of imperialist, tribal, pseudo-mystical tribal nation that says that all people should become Americans, in the sense that they should all be able to imagine themselves as liberal, cosmopolitan citizens and be able to be both German and Americans, or Turks and Americans, or Indians and Americans, or Chinese and Americans, is I think a fascinating way to read it, and not entire. And I think there's good grounds for reading it that way. I take that to be your point in some way, Jerry, if I haven't misunderstood it.
No, thank you.
Yep. John.
My takeaway from not only this chapter, but let me stay on this specific chapter. I didn't find the discussion on panism and tribalism as an argument for anti-humanity, maybe for anti-humanism. But what it seems to me to be or at least what I'm taking from this, it's not the various and the multi-isms that exist that is so important. It is how is it possible for us to communicate and talk? I dare say there's maybe 80 or 100 people on this call. I imagine that many of us are quite different from each other, but the real thrust is, can we communicate with each other? And I think this is her point. For me, this is her point. How do we come together with the various isms that don't destroy us? I don't see the isms as an argument against humanity. I see it more as it validates the fact that humanity is varied. But the essential idea is, how do we communicate? How do we live with each other regardless of the isms that may be grasping us at the moment? And are there isms that prevent that from taking place at all? And if they do exist, how do we confront them? How do rational people or a rational collective confront that? Because that becomes the threat to humanity.
Yeah.
But I don't think the varied humanisms invalidate the concept of humanity. It only, to me, it does the opposite. It validates it.
Well, she certainly wants to validate the concept of humanity. Yes, you're right. You know, her response to tribal nationalism, right, is to create a state like the United States that is not a nation state, in which you don't sacrifice the territorial limited equality of all people within it to a national principle or a racial principle. And so, you know, from her point of view, we want to create states, or maybe even better yet, federations, in which there are different homelands and tribal regions, where people can go and be Jews or liberals or cosmopolitans. But the overarching unity is we respect each other in our differences and in our different ways of lives. That's her politics, and it's a politics that, in an interesting way, tries to balance cosmopolitanism and tribalism. Tries to say that humanity actually needs both, and you can't really just become cosmopolitan, because even cosmopolitan is a tribe. You have to give room for tribalism, and yet you have to limit tribalism, and you can only do that politically, by not by simply telling the tribe that they're wrong, or that they are prejudiced and not educated enough. And so, just, this is a preview. You guys get it here. The conference next year, the Hannah Arendt Center conference, is going to be on tribalism and cosmopolitanism. It's going to be on this question. This is the question that I think, in the wake of the conference we just had on friendship, and also in the wake of what's going on in Israel and Palestine, and also in Ukraine and Russia, I've been struggling and thinking about this question of to what extent we are all tribal peoples, and yet how do we also rise above that? And so this is the question that is driving me today, these days, and so to think about how to both make room for tribalism and also provide a space for overcoming of the worst parts of tribalism through politics and humanity is exactly what we're going to try and talk about next year at the conference. So thank you, John. That's very helpful. We only have a couple minutes, so I'm going to try and take these last two questions. Rachel and Tim.
Hopefully this is picking up on your concerns about the limits of the dangers, but recognition of tribalism. And one thing that occurs to me is the historic specificity of this chapter, in the sense that the pan movements arise before totalitarianism. The Bolsheviks and the Nazis make use of their ideologies, but there is a certain geographical impetus in their original thing. They were rootless people, and they wanted, the nation was breaking down and the empires were breaking down, and they wanted to find some kind of substitute for genuine boundaries. And it was a failed attempt, but it was still an attempt to I guess at the very beginning, she mentioned the Continental Imperialism not having the benefit of, say, the British Empire being, an island that is a sea power, that's the land power situation. And I wonder if that one of the most interesting questions is the present conversation about, as I think you indicated, the rise of a multipolar world. And as opposed to a unipolar world, and the sort of collective West, insistence on imposing a liberal hegemony around the entire world. And I think it's an open question, the degree to which those who are arguing for a multipolar world are sincere and trustworthy in their accounts, because on the one hand, we can see dangers in some of the things they're suggesting, but on the other hand, it might be wise to consider the possibility that our so-called enemies like Russia or Iran or China do not actually have totalitarian ambitions, but it's potentially possible to have a multipolar world where we sort of reinvest in international law and cooperate without war and continual disruptions and top-down impositions. And I wonder, but from that point, the observation she makes about different types of bureaucracies and superstitions and the dangers that are involved in these different types of systems seem to be very applicable to these different the multipolar situation. And yeah, that's just one thing that occurred to me in reading this chapter.
Yeah, no, thanks, Rachel. I mean, you're making an argument somewhat similar to John Mersheimer at the University of Chicago. His argument is, look, Ukraine, is not an independent country. It's part of the Russian sphere of influence. Taiwan is not an independent country. It's part of the China sphere of influence. And so, what you're saying is you can have an international rules, law-based order, but also let China take over Taiwan and let Russia take over Ukraine. And that's an argument. The argument against it is that if you actually believe in a rules-based order, it's up to Taiwan and it's up to Ukraine to decide whether they are under the Russian sphere and the Chinese sphere of influence. And that's the,
well, obviously we would not have a CIA-sponsored coup in Ukraine if that argument was valid.
Yeah. I don't want to get too into the weeds, but yes, thank you. Tim, we're right. Just quickly, can you just say it quickly?
Sure. It's nice to be here, Roger. Great forum. I'll be coming every week. My observation is that there is something race-based happening with the great replacement theory that tends to want to minoritize or make white Americans anticipate a minority status. And that tends to make me think about what Arendt might have had to say about insurgency from from threatened minorities, people thinking that they're losing their grip on power.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it's a good question. Let's table it for next week, Tim, because in chapter 9 next week we're going to be talking about this question with the minority treaties. So the chapter is split into two parts, one on the decline of the nation state and the other is these minority treaties. And that will, I think, be a good opportunity for us to, so maybe re-raise your question next week, if you don't mind, since we're out of time now, and it'll be a good time for us to talk about it. Listen, thank you all. This has been a great conversation. I hope you enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Just so you know, if you haven't seen it already, we're gonna continue reading this book into the new year. We're not gonna finish it by next week, which is the last meeting for 2023. And then after it, we're going to start Eichmann in Jerusalem, which is a book we've only read once and never finished recording it because some of the recordings got messed up when we did it. So we'll start that sometime in late February, early March, depending on when we finish this book. But the new schedule, at least aspirationally, is up on the website, and you can see where it's going. Thank you all very much. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you for the insight.
Thank you, everyone.
Gracias,
Thank you, Professor.
Ciao,
Thank you, Roger.
profe.
Ciao.
Excelente, excellent, Professor Roger, excelente.
Yes, thank you. Bye, everybody. Have a great week.